Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on Thomas Frank's One Market Under God. Great title. Perhaps it'll be the new national hymn. This event is one in a series of altogether 15 events this week that we have scheduled with our hardworking guests. Thomas Frank is a very distinguished political analyst, public historian. If you look him up on Amazon, you'll find that people compare him with H.L. Mencken, which I'm sure pleases you, no doubt. And,
I wrote all those.
Did you?
I wrote those.
Yeah. He was telling us yesterday how H.L. Mencken was not only his hero when he was young, but his lifetime pick-me-up when he's depressed. He reads some Mencken because the taste of vitriol wakes him right up and makes him feel like his life has a purpose, which actually I think plenty of people get from Mencken. Before we start, let me just call your attention to two other events that are coming up. There's one this evening where he is giving a lecture, the Robert Hess Memorial Lecture. It'll be in Tanger Auditorium at 5:30 with the very intriguing title, Against Creativity. We all hear creativity praised as much as motherhood and the Chevy Corvair. So perhaps it's as dubious. And then tomorrow, he and the distinguished columnist and Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman are having a public conversation in Whitman Auditorium at 12:30 on the legacy of the Obama administration, which isn't all of one stripe. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
We'll probably disagree on some couple of things, probably.
Well, yes, I'm sure you will.
We'll probably spend the first hour just talking about how awful George Bush was or something like that.
Maybe. But then, as columnists, you learn to be, at least, I should just say, dramaturgically disagreeable. You have to be willing to get into a fight even with people that you agree with in order to sell papers, right? That's right. He explained that to us yesterday, too.
Yes.
This has been a very entertaining and revealing set of insights into the life of a working author, political author, who has been enormously successful. His books are very widely read. The most famous one is called What's the Matter with Kansas? Kansas is where he grew up, and Kansas played an important role in the election of 2000, among other things. And his book is, I won't try to describe it now. I just want to give you a sense that this is a very rare opportunity to listen to a first-rate mind who has been, he has a PhD, but he's not a professor, which is in itself quite a distinction. He just writes books and columns. He's been a columnist for, 20 years, 25 years?
No, not that long. Only since 2008.
Oh, when you started writing for the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
Yes, he's very liberal, so he was hired by the Wall Street Journal to be their kept liberal. He roamed their editorial pages like a tiger, and I'm sure they haven't forgotten him. And he's going to be in discussion with Professor Barbara Winslow, who's a professor of education here at Brooklyn College.
And women and gender studies.
And
How could you ever forget?
Say that again?
How could you forget women and gender studies?
I wasn't finished. You have to let people pause for dramatic effect. And women and gender studies. And she's also and history. And also the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project. And quite an important activist on this campus. And quite a challenging conversationalist, let me say. So this should be really exciting. So who's beginning?
I guess I am.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do? It's hot in here. Did you notice that? the middle of winter and it's hot in here.
Actually, it's spring. Remember? His birthday
Yeah, my birthday.
was the first day of spring.
I turned 50 just the other day. That's it. Thank you.
The sun is finally out.
So what I thought I would do, and this is going to be a little tricky for me, so this is an old, the book that I'm going to talk about was called One Market Under God, and it was published in the year 2000. But it was writing it and publishing it was very exciting. This was the moment of what they called the new economy. So from about 1996 up till 2001, the U.S. economy was in this state of incredible boom. Like it was just growing like crazy. Unemployment was unusually low, but unemployment wasn't what anybody talked about. What everybody talked about was the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average at some point there hit 10,000, which was, when I was a kid, it had, it spent, I think, like 30 years bouncing around 1,000. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, it zoomed up and it actually hit 10,000. And then you had another index called the NASDAQ that went from like nothing in the course of that decade to 5,000. It was incredible. And we'll be reviewing some of that. But it was a crazy time, culturally speaking. This is when CNBC, the all business talk network, got its start, and things like business literature, business culture, things like Fortune magazine bulked up to be the size of a phone book. Oh, you guys don't know what a phone book is. It was like 500. Fortune magazine. My children don't know what I referred to the yellow pages the other day, and my son is like, "What is that? What do you mean?" The Fortune magazine each issue would be like 400 pages. It would be all advertisements. And the ads weren't just, here's our product, we're selling it. They were religious in nature. They were about, it's as though Madison Avenue discovered the human soul. But of course they're always talking about business and business services. And that wasn't just Fortune. It was just across the board. It was the entire culture of this country was caught up in this kind of stock market frenzy, speculative frenzy, you'd say, only it was bigger than that. And I don't know if any of you remember those days, but it's really something to have lived through, even though I didn't profit from it at all. I didn't have any money. I didn't have any shares of stock. I was just watching this happen and watching this unfold. And it was very similar to another historical episode that you probably know about, the Roaring Twenties. And it's funny how the economic system that we live under, we have these great technological advances, but culturally it repeats itself, sometimes almost word for word, as you're going to see in this presentation. So here's the problem: is this presentation is from about the book. Okay, so I was writing the book while this was going on, this superheated business culture, this climate of insane celebration that was going on. I was writing the book, and I would have the TV set tuned to CNBC, and these people constantly talking up the stock market every day, and I would try to get that sort of overheated enthusiasm into the book, and that's what I really tried to do. And my great good fortune was the book came out, and it was very skeptical about all this stuff, needless to say, came out right when it started crashing. So I was on my book tour when the bubble burst and the market started crashing, and it's not really good form to cheer for a stock market crash. But damn it, I did that time. I tell you what. And it was what's funny is it was just all the sort of the heroes and villains of that episode are pretty much forgotten today, and especially the villains. And we'll go over some of the villains from back then. A lot of guys went to jail. By the way, the big difference between that crash and then the crash of the last few years, George Bush became president right after this. He was best friends with the CEO of a company called Enron, who was one of the big. One of the most celebrated companies in the 1990s, and then became one of the biggest, most hated companies in America overnight in the early 2000s. And even though George Bush was personal friends with a lot of the officers of this company, he prosecuted them. They went to prison. Okay, big difference between that and Barack Obama. And at the time, we all thought George Bush was a buffoon and made fun of him, and I still do. But at least he did that. All right, so let me go into this is about the 90s. So it's going to at times look very familiar, but remember we're talking about something that's now almost 20 years ago, most of this. So start with the statistics. Okay, this was, people in the late 90s were very worried about something called inequality. Actually, people in the early 90s were very worried about it, but as the economy heated up, inequality got worse and worse and worse. And the reason I include this stuff is at the time, it was very unpopular to talk about this. Nobody talked about inequality. It was considered really in bad taste, as bad as cheering for a stock market crash. But this is the crazy thing. So you can one way to measure inequality is as a ratio of what CEOs are paid to what workers are paid. And in the 90s, it hit kind of all-time high, 400 times. That's the average in America, which means that some CEOs are paid much, much, much more than that. I don't think we've ever got back to that. I don't think we're still, even today, haven't got back to that. Wealth concentration. These are all, shocking things. At the time, it's much worse than that now. This is the inequality in the country, the Gini index. 1920s, roaring 20s, stock market crash, and here we are now. Today, we're back up here. But what I was writing back then is, oh no, look what's happening. We're on our way back. Oh no, it's much worse than that now. Here's the same thing. This is what's his name? Thomas Piketty. This comes from the French economist who studies inequality. This too has gotten much, much worse since that came out. That's in the late 90s. Today it's we're at an all-time high today for this one. We're above the 1920s now. I mean, we're basically at an age, we're at a level of inequality that that's never been recorded before. We don't have good numbers for the 19th century, so people speculate that it's like the 19th century all over again, but we don't really know. Hell, for all we know, it might be like the Roman Empire or something, This is in other countries, so you see France and Britain are behaving very differently. Okay, now let's see if I can find the text, what I used to say about this stuff, before we get to the fun stuff.
Question, that wage inequality before, that was between whom and whom?
CEOs and their average line workers, so blue-collar workers, at the same company. And there's ways to do this. AFL-CIO has a website that tracks this statistic. It's called Executive Pay Watch. They still do this, but that's where that came from back in those days, from those guys. So while all of this is going on, it's kind of we're clearly entering a new era of inequality in the 1990s. And while this is going on, you have someone like me who's pointing these things out. But by and large, the culture of the country wasn't, let's talk about inequality the way it is now. I mean, we're doing that now, and I think that's healthy. But back then, it was different. This is the age of the new economy. And the term that I used to describe it was market populism. And what people would talk about back then was what they called the business revolution. They'd use this term all the time. They would talk about the empowered consumer, the onward charging bull market. Basically, the idea was that not that we had entered an era of inequality, but we had entered an era of economic democracy. And that's what they were saying in the 1990s, okay? And the idea was that markets were a popular system, that markets were a form of democracy, and in fact that markets were in some ways more democratic than elections, right? Because they reflect our wishes in all these different ways. Every click we do on the internet, everything we buy down at the supermarket, the market takes all this into account and gives us what we want, delivers us these fantastically democratic results far more efficiently and far better than, our stupid electoral system, right? So that was the great idea of the 90s. And this notion was everywhere you went back in those days. And so business leaders would basically merge themselves with the common people, describe themselves as just humble working people. And the greatest thing about this language of economic democracy and the business revolution that you saw in the 90s was that it reversed the language of social class. So businessmen were sort of describing themselves as friends of the common, ordinary people in their war with what they would call elites, and what they meant by elites was the government or organized labor, people that would try to regulate or restrict market operations from outside the market. Those were acts of elitism, but what business people were doing were acts of democracy. Oh, and by the way, the other big elite was, of course, the university professors, right? Because you always think you know better than the market, right? But the market is like God. The market knows everything. The market sees everything. The market is omniscient. And the market delivers justice, always. Just results. Let's look at some illustrations of this. Okay, so the idea is that capitalism has reformed itself and has become this much more what would you say, friendly and approachable system. So as it's becoming, you saw the charts, much more unequal, it's selling itself as being something much more democratic. Okay, business has finally turned a corner. You've got the business revolution, and business is a form of democracy. Just look, it's diverse, it's cool. Jesus Christ. Okay, so there's a whole theme of describing business in the language of youth culture. Business being cool, business being extreme. We'll see a bunch of this later. Some of my favorite ads were I have videotapes of them somewhere, like up in my attic. There's one of an ad that shows, it looks like a strike. It's the common people running down the canyons of lower New York, pouring. It looks like the Civil War, class war is on. The common people are pouring down the streets, screaming, protesting. They get to the stock exchange and they smash down the doors of the New York Stock Exchange. And what do they want? They want the Daytech brokerage, right? They want to be able to participate in the stock exchange. And the idea is that brokerages have been keeping them from being able to do this, right? So once you get cool companies that are that understand how markets are democratic, then everything's cool. Some of the biggest bestsellers of the period. We'll come to that in a second. But anyhow, so this is cool companies. Corporate America rocks. I don't know if you've heard this, but Corporate America rocks. Frank Gehry, there's this enormous vogue for the architecture of Frank Gehry. I'm going to be talking about this later today in the creativity talk. That's a business school in Cleveland. And you see the idea here. It's like, it speaks for itself, right? But that's the business revolution.
Excuse me, he was going to build downtown Brooklyn.
Frank Gehry?
Yeah.
Man, you're lucky to escape that guy. Actually, what am I saying?
He's the economic collapse prevented it, but they were going to have all these Gehry buildings downtown Brooklyn.
But Gehry is in some ways, he's like the what would you call it? Like the stereotypical figure of this whole sort of historical period that we're in. This incredible inequality, but always described as a matter of creativity and innovation. See, here's an executive. The operations of business are like protesting. You see, she's an executive freedom fighter. This was a very common image. I forget even what this is for. I'm sure for some brokerage or something. But the idea that it is, they're using the imagery of the 60s here, the imagery of like communism, basically. Seize power. How do you seize power? Well, by investing your money with this guy rather than the other guy. Another one. This was all over the place in those days. This is I again don't remember what this is advertising. I'm sure I've got it somewhere in a folder deep in the basement. And then there was I'm sort of switching gears here in youth culture, but this is not youth culture. This is just in consumer culture generally. There was this vogue for things that were extreme. Okay, and it was all over the place. It was we'll talk about this in detail later. But extreme candy, extreme meat, extreme flavored Gatorade. I love that one. I wonder if you can still get that. There's an extreme roller coaster, extreme right guard, extreme Jello. I love that one. And this is some extreme Christian worship service. Okay, this one's kind of interesting. So this is when is that? This is 2002. It's a little bit later, but again, business describing itself in the language of hip alternative youth culture. So the Korean economy had really taken off in those days, or I should say in the early aughts. They had a bad downturn in the late 90s, a crisis. It got bailed out, and we're coming back in the early aughts. And when this happened, Business Week didn't say Korea is prosperous, or the stock market is they've got a bull market in Korea. No, it's cool. Korea is cool. It was always everything was being described with the language of coolness. Let's see, what was I going to talk about? Oh, so the stock market investing literature of the time was the exact same theme. One of the best-selling stock market, or what would you call it, personal financial advice books of the time was by a guy called Peter Lynch, who was a mutual fund manager. Do y'all know what this is? It's a way that ordinary people can invest in the stock market very easily. You put your money in what's called a mutual fund, and they choose your investments for you. And he was a very successful mutual fund manager, and he wrote a series of books about what made him successful. And it was always these moral categories, that he was very humble, and he didn't try to get above himself, and he didn't invest in complicated things. And he said, oh golly, what is the quote? Somehow I didn't bring it with me, but something like he wouldn't invest in any idea that he couldn't illustrate with a crayon, or something like that, which is pretty good, when you think about it. My favorite one was oh wait, there's more of this stuff. God, how much of this do I have? Again, business has reformed itself, the business revolution, it's down with the people, it's lovable. This was, okay, the NASDAQ hit 5,000. This is the front page of the of the Wall Street Journal business section that day. That's what the chart looked like. Is that not insane? And people are like, this is going to go on forever. This is one of the strange things that happens when you have a bubble in the stock market like this, is that people start saying that this is going to go on forever. You saw the same thing during the housing bubble. People saying that, the price of real estate never goes down. Do you remember this? It wasn't that long ago that people were saying that. Well, people were saying the same thing about this. It burst days later. It's like, But people were publishing books saying things like, where is it? Dow 36,000. This is never going to end. It's going to go on and on and on. Of course, that didn't come to pass. Beardstown Ladies. So the idea here was, it was a bunch of grandmas in a small town in Illinois who picked stocks and who invested in. They had an investment club, and they'd get together with their savings, and they would choose which stocks to buy. And this was a common thing in the 1990s. You don't see it that often anymore, these investment clubs. And these ladies claimed to be phenomenally successful investors. And there was a brief flurry of media interest in them, and they were on talk shows all over the country and this kind of thing. And they wrote a book. It is their investment guide. And again, the idea is the successful investor is this very humble person. So, it's like little old ladies in central Illinois can invest better than some hotshot broker down on Wall Street. That is literally the idea, that average people can beat the Wall Street professionals. And so their investment book is filled with their investment advice, and then sprinkled in with like recipes for things. Like, this is our recipe for, a cake, and this is our recipe for, whatever, meatloaf or something like that. But the idea is that Wall Street is your friend. It is the friend of average people, the most average people you could come up with, right? It's your pal. And the idea is that it's, the market is the friend of the average man, or the average citizen, I should say. Got to get that gender neutral language in there, right? Got to work on that. This is what I never speak to audiences anymore, so again, same idea here. This book, they would give this out to you if you took a test drive of a Ford back in the 90s, they'd give you a copy of this book, The Millionaire Next Door. The idea is, of course, exactly the same idea. The market favors the average person, not the snob on Wall Street, but your average ordinary guy who drives a Ford and lives next door and lives in a very humble manner. And then, the whole idea here is that the market is an expression of of the people's optimism about the economy. And so this is a market that is defined by we the people. It's an act of democratic faith, not an act of like these guys on Wall Street, bidding things up or doing some kind of machination that we don't understand, which is exactly what it turned out they were doing. But at the time, it was sold as being this utterly democratic phenomenon. And because we the people believed we were driving it up to 36,000, this was actually his theory. So these two guys, the two authors of this, were taken very seriously at the time. James Glassman was a columnist for the Washington Post. Kevin Hassett is a Republican economist. He's been in and out of Republican administrations. He's taken very seriously in Washington, D.C. And they wrote this book, and the argument of the book is that the public has figured out the stock market. And because the public now understand, little old ladies in central Illinois understand the stock market, they're driving it up to 36,000. They're driving the Dow to 36,000. Where does the Dow stand today? Does anybody know? It's at I think 18,000, right? So it's halfway there. But they weren't saying the Dow will hit 36,000 eventually. They were saying it belongs there now. There's nothing can stop this bull market that we're in the 90s. The imagery of revolution, of course, this is the common people. Look, they're attacking Wall Street. They're tearing down the signpost, again, the fists, right? The common people are attacking Wall Street by what? By investing in the stock market. Is it not well, this is some of the text that went with this illustration. This is from Fortune magazine, this illustration. The author said, what we have here is nothing short of a revolution. Power, and this is Fortune magazine, power that for generations lay with a few thousand white males on a small island in New York City is now being seized by every man and every woman. Don't you love that? So the average people were what was driving this stock market. So it wasn't just rising prices, it was social confrontation. It was a revolution that was supposed to bring power to the small and the meek. The internet bubble. Here's an Okie from the 1930s. And the internet is going to rescue him. I don't even remember what the hell they were doing with this. It's just so crazy. I'll skip that. Then the real, at the end of the bubble, you had a series of internet companies that had essentially no earnings, or not much in the way of earnings. And they would be bid up to these stratospheric, unbelievable highs, right? And there was nothing to show for it. The company didn't have earnings, so there was no way to actually know what the company was worth. People were just gambling and expecting that someone would buy it from them later on down the road for a higher price. That's what a bubble is. And there was a whole series of these, and the companies, their appeal was all based on this kind of sort of populism thing, that we are actually, the people bidding this up are actually betting on ourselves. There's actually a TV commercial in those days for a brokerage. This is some of the language in the commercial. We're not relying on, these are guys, day traders. These are guys who are sitting around in their suburban rec room trading stocks online all day. And they're doing it through this online brokerage. And here's what they say to the camera. We're not relying on the government. We're not relying on the company. We're not relying on a big fat inheritance. No. What they're doing is trading online. We're betting on ourselves. That's by investing in this, but they aren't investing. This is by definition speculation, right? This is not investing. This is something different. And they bid these things up to these insane heights: eBay, Amazon.com, Priceline, a bunch of other ones. Some of these companies are still around, and in fact, all of those companies I just mentioned are still around, and some of them now have earnings, and actually now have, you can tell what the company is worth, and you can make a rational bid. You can guess what it should be priced at today. But back then there was no way to know. Okay, where are we here? Oh yes. Then it all ended kind of badly. But this is the kind of thing that you see at the very end of a bull market. Okay, stuff like this. This was a special report, Forbes magazine. George Gilder was one of the great stock pickers of the era. He had also been an advisor to Ronald Reagan, which is kind of curious, and had written a series of books. He's like the opposite of Tom Frank. He wrote a series of books about how free markets are the friend of average people, and this kind of thing, and we just have to deregulate and privatize. And he became a stock picker. It's a very curious incident. In the late 90s, he became the most successful stock picker in America and was followed by millions of people. Whatever he said to buy, they'd buy it. And this was one issue of his special report. Cover of Forbes magazine. The quote is from a guy. Now this is really interesting. This is I couldn't believe it when this happened. In the 1920s, in the bubble in the 1920s, it ended so badly with the Great Crash. People were saying the same thing, that this is a democratic revolution. This is like ma and pa investor getting in the stock market. And at the very peak of that bubble, you had this character, John Raskob. I believe he was the head of General Motors, but I might be wrong, who came out and wrote an article in, I think, something like a Ladies' Home Journal, or what was the standard a housewives magazine in the 1920s. Ladies' Home Journal.
The 20s?
In the 20s.
McCall.
I think it was Ladies' Home Journal, though.
Good
It was a good
housekeeping,
housekeeping? Okay. But he wrote an article called this in that magazine for your average American housewife. Everyone ought to be rich. How should we be rich? By investing in the stock market. And it came out, and this is, for a lot of people, this is a sort of cultural signal that the bubble has gone too far. When you see things like this. And his words became infamous. And so if you ever read a history of the 1920s, it'll have this quotation in it, because he said it right before the bubble burst. Right? So he's saying, everybody get in the stock market. Then the next day it's like, meow. Right? And here's Forbes magazine says, no, he was right. And they said, no, he was right. Like a few days before, meow, it blew up again. This guy is like a double jinx. But here we go. So Fast Company magazine was one of the hot magazines of the 1990s. The idea of the business revolution, to get back to that, the idea that that what was happening in the corporate world was a revolution of some unspecified kind, and they used all this communist language, socialist imagery, rules for revolutionaries. Of course, he's swiping a title from a famous book that conservatives like to talk about a lot now, called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. Have you guys heard about this? It's sort of because it has some association with Obama, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Obama worked for an Alinsky group or something.
Organizer.
Right, so the right has fastened on this original book as a sort of devil book that has ruined America. But here's your, back in the 90s, people had a very different idea about it. Here's some Soviet art repurposed as, as a promotional, some kind of management theory thing. Do y'all ever read management theory? Do you even know what I'm talking about when I refer to management theory? This is when you go out into the workforce, this is the stuff that your boss reads. Okay, it's how you manage people, how you make people work, how you get them to do what you want them to do and not what they want to do. And that's the management theory. Was the 90s was a great heyday for management theory. There are all these books coming out about this kind of corporate revolution and that kind of corporate revolution. Books about leadership, books about creativity, books about self-awareness. These are all for managers, teaching you how to run your corporation. I'm sorry. It just goes on way too damn long. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. So one of the big changes in the corporate revolution was the idea that the CEO was a man of the people. Oh, here we go. This is before I tell you the story of the corporate revolution. This is the end of it here. This is one of the big management theorists of the 90s, Gary Hamel. Okay, and he wrote a series of best-selling books. He was a really big deal. And he got together all of his favorite CEOs And they called it, it wasn't going to be like, let's share the management secrets of the rich and powerful. It's the revolutionaries' ball. And what I love about this is you've got the CEO of Enron, and you've got Dennis Kozlowski of Tyco, who just got out of prison. Ken Lay never did time. He was found guilty, but died of a heart attack before he could start serving his sentence. Didn't really end very well. This is what the workplace was really like in the 90s. This is the Detroit newspaper strike. This is one of the last of the big newspaper strikes. I think the last. That didn't end well for the workers. Okay, so that's reality. This is what management theorists thought they were doing. Okay, they were liberating you. It wasn't you go out there on the picket lines and liberate yourself. It's you were liberated by your company being more capitalistic than before. So the more closely attuned to the market. I don't know if this is making any sense. Tom Peters, who was another one of the great management theorists of the 90s and who's still around, I'm sure he's doing the same kind of thing. His big idea was that we had to destroy the corporation and make it more capitalistic, that the corporation wasn't capitalist enough. And why is that? Because if you ever study economics, one of the things that you'll learn about is that the corporations harbor within themselves all kinds of non-market relations. Like when you want to use the photocopier at work, you don't go and bid to use the photocopier or try to negotiate a deal with the guy who owns the photocopier. No, you just go and use it, okay? Well, that's socialism. That's not capitalism. That's something else. That's like, bureaucracy or organization or something like that. And so Tom Peters' idea was that we have to inject market forces into the firm at every level, into the corporation at every level. The corporation has to become capitalist, okay? And of course he described this as what? Liberation. Right? That was just automatically the language that came to people's tongues in those days. Leading the revolution. That's what we're doing. Here's this lead singer of Black Flag. Do you remember that band? Yeah. And he's like, whatever, Nortel Networks. Corporate revolution is on, my friend. Here's the CEO of Amazon.com. He's so beloved of his workers that he's autographing their hard hats. This is the kind of an illustration of the corporate revolution. There's the old and the new. The old is the unionized elf. The new, this is in Santa's factory. The old is the unionized elf. The new is the sort of virtual assistant that that answers to market forces. This is what you didn't want to be. So they're deploying this kind of, what would you say, like political correctness to advance the idea of the market. This is who you don't want to be. You don't ever want to deal with this guy. Oh, what happened? Oh yeah, here we go. The revolution. This is so the corporate revolution is it's what's written on the wall. You've seen the writing on the wall. You've seen the writing on the elevator. God, it goes on and on and on. The corporate revolution is allowing people to actualize themselves, to understand who they are by becoming better workers. I remember I didn't make any of this up. This is all real. This all really happened. Yeah, that was a common image in those days. I love this one. Okay, corporate America. Yo, corporate America. The corporate revolution is in full effect, and the worker is now dictating to management. He says, you management have to do what I want, and I've got all sorts of weird, funky tastes. And you have to let me express myself at work, and I'm going to even bring my bird. Because workers have the power now. You get it? Workers are in control. And in fact, now that we all answer to the market and they're taking away benefits and you don't have a retirement plan anymore, what is that? What is that called? That's free agency. That's freedom. Okay. A little side note here. This guy was a speechwriter for Al Gore, the guy that wrote this book. So we often think, it's all so awful, all these conservatives and Republicans and everything. No. It's a Democrat here. And the president, while all this was going on, was a Democrat. The president was enthusiastic about this stuff, a great consumer of management theory. See if we can, oh yeah. Then there's the soulfulness about this, okay? It took on a religious aspect towards the end. And it went so far, this is an ad from Merrill Lynch, the brokerage that went under during the last crisis. And it's telling you that, you've gone too far, America. You're worshiping computers. Don't worship computers. Worship the people who invented the computer. This was a common theme, like I said, towards the end of the 1990s, the idea that the corporation had a soul, that we had to understand that soul. I mean, maybe the corporation has an afterlife too. I don't know. Maybe the corporation gets to go and meet its maker at some point. And where this came from, it took me a long time to understand why anybody would write something like that. Like the corporate soul. It's so obviously fatuous. Why would you do? I mean, obviously you want to, if you are trying to sell the corporation as the sort of telos of human existence, right, or the market as the end of, that is the greatest thing about human life ever invented, you're going to say that the corporation has a soul, and in fact the corporation is in some ways more human than the rest of us, that its soul is in some ways more advanced than ours. But it still is ridiculous, right? It's a stupid idea. And there was many books written about this in the 90s. And I don't mean books making fun of this, I mean books trying to tease out the different aspects of the corporate soul. Like there was a book talking about how corporations were technically immortal, right? Because they can live for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they don't go, unless they go bankrupt or something like that, it just go on and on and on. And so therefore it's like a higher being than we are, and this kind of thing, which is, it's obviously stupid. And it took me years to figure out why they were doing this. And it finally occurred to me, it's again this kind of weird dialogue that you find in the economy with things that happened a long time ago, like that quote from John Raska about everyone ought to be rich. What they're doing here is they're talking about an old critique of corporations from the 19th century, where in the old days, if you were a socialist or a populist or a progressive or something like that, you would denounce the corporation by saying the soulless corporation. The soulless corporation has done this to us, blah, 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 this soulless monopoly. And so their idea is now 100 years later is to refute that by developing this whole theology of the corporate soul. And this went on and on and on. I mean, you could write a whole book just revisiting this literature. Thankfully, it's dead now. Nobody writes this kind of stuff that I know of. Do you know of anybody that writes this sort of thing anymore? I think it's gone. So the idea that the corporation is a higher order of living being than we are, I love that. Tom Peters wrote a book called The Brand Called You. It came out in 1997, where the idea is to flip it entirely. Not only is the corporation a higher being than we are, but we have to mimic the corporation. So you have to think of yourself as a brand, and you have to market yourself in the way. So, they are the model for us, not the other way around. This is one of my friends in Chicago picked up a volume of leadership prayers at a megachurch out in the Chicago suburbs. This is the prayer on the subject of succession. Help me remember, God, that I can be reassigned, neutralized, or eliminated for 1,000 different reasons at any moment. My leadership is precarious, hanging by the silver thread of the people's trust in me. Countless things over which I have no control can break that thread, and I will be gone. But they need a leader, and when I am gone, they must have others to turn to, others whom they can trust, who can tell them the truth. O God of mercy, don't let me stay in this job one day too long, and don't let this all fall apart after I leave. I will not last forever, God. Where are my replacements? That's real. I didn't make that up. It's a guy praying to be fired. It's almost insane. And that was the spirit of the times. It was almost insane. I mean, you could say that about the bubble that we just came through. The real estate bubble was almost insane. There are so many things like that. it's sometimes I feel now like we've come back to earth in so many ways. It's easy to see what the politics of all this are. That what we're talking about here is not anything rational. We're talking about the social legitimacy of the corporation. That's, at the end of the day, that's the bottom line. We're talking about the legitimacy of this particular social form, the corporation. And that you shouldn't regulate it, you shouldn't go on strike against it, you shouldn't ask it for higher pay, you shouldn't do all these things to it. You certainly shouldn't nationalize it. You should always bail it out if it gets in trouble. And you should do these things because it's so soulful and because it's in a state of revolution and it's actualizing its employees and it's doing all of these wonderful things. And in fact, the corporation is just us in a more exalted form. Okay, I'm going to, let's see, what's the last thing I'm going to tell you about? So, yeah, here, the Wall Street could basically, you're not going to remember this. At the end of the 90s, there was a move to privatize Social Security. And again, not the Republicans, this was Bill Clinton, wanted to privatize Social Security. We were saved from that fate by a woman named Monica Lewinsky. Who's, as far as I'm concerned, a hero. But there was, when Bill Clinton proposed this, the entire Wall Street advertising apparatus chimed in. They're like, yes, exactly, privatize Social Security, put that money in the stock market. That is a great idea. And so here's one example of that. This is another mutual fund company saying that basically we can do what Social Security did. We are Franklin Roosevelt. Wall Street, Franklin Roosevelt and Wall Street are like mortal enemies. Again, they're debating from something in the distant past, something 60 years before. Franklin Roosevelt, Wall Street's greatest enemy. No, Wall Street can do what Franklin Roosevelt wanted to do, and we can do the job much better. Last, this was the grossest book of management theory I think I've ever come across. It's called Who Moved My Cheese? Have you ever heard of this? It's still in print. Bosses routinely buy it and make their employees read it. I've heard of companies where they have to get together in a room and everybody has to read it out loud. And you wonder why anyone would do this, right? Are you familiar with the book? It's basically, it is a parable of worker powerlessness, okay? And it's written in great big print. And it's written in fourth grade language so everybody can understand it. And it refers to workers as little people, all one word, little people. And they are like mice in a laboratory maze, the little people. And they wake up every day and they go running off to find their cheese, which means to do their work. But one day, their cheese is no longer there. And the little people have to come to terms with that. And there's several of them. Okay, one of them embraces change, which they used to always say in the 90s, you have to embrace change. You have to adapt yourself to this. You have to realize that you're a free agent. And he goes off in search of the new low-wage cheese and discovers that this search is really fulfilling and soulful and self-actualizing and all the rest of this crap that we've been seeing. But another one of the little people, the workers, gets all upset and kicks and screams and yells, "Who moved my cheese?" And that's supposed to be like, people who get angry when they lose their benefits or when somebody steals their pension or, I'll just think, or let's say that, they lose their house gets foreclosed upon or any of the kind of disasters that are so common in our economy nowadays. They're standing around yelling, "Who moved my cheese?" And this is supposed to be a mistake that's so obviously transparent and such a grave offense that the person that does this deserves to be fired, okay? You cannot question the cheese mover, the prime cheese mover, which is to say the market. You don't get to question it. You don't get to ask about where your cheese went. You have to submit. Unfortunately, that only takes, telling this story, the author only burns up about 60 pages, and you can't sell a book that's 60 pages long. So the book suddenly changes tone, and it tells a different story, and this is the story of how this business about the little people in the maze and the cheese might be used as a tool of labor pacification. And so the author then takes us to a group of white-collar management types who are sitting around a table talking about how profound this idea of the cheese being moved, and the person who gets upset about it, how profound this cheese story is. And one of the white-collar people says to the other, we've been instituting change in our workplace, and a lot of the workers are pretty unhappy about it. And I sure wish that this cheese story came in a book so I could make them read it. And that's in the book, yeah. And that's what happens, right? And so people buy this book by the pallet load and, have it hauled into the workplace with the forklift and make everybody sit around and read the damn thing. And so that's what I want to end with. The idea that the market is capable of resolving all of our social conflict fairly and justly. That's the sort of great idea of the 1990s, and we all know now what a crock that is, And I think that what we need in order to restore some kind of sense of fairness is not the final triumph of markets over the body and soul of humanity, but something that confronts markets and that refuses to think of itself as a brand, and that, isn't going to confine his or her problems to the search for authenticity. Because in the end, it just doesn't matter all that much or shouldn't matter all that much to the people on the receiving end of all these things I've been describing. It shouldn't matter whether the guy who downsizes us is wearing a blue serge suit or a nose ring, right? Who cares? So that's what the book is about. Now you know. Now you don't have to go out and buy it.
I'm going to be very brief because
I took up all your time.
No,
I'm
you
so
didn't.
sorry.
Hush, sit down.
I forgot.
Sit down, because this is too difficult an act to follow. But I want to just make 2 points to sort of help us with discussions. I'm an old-fashioned Groucho Marxist, and another Marxist once said that religion was the opiate of the masses, and Karl Marx was not a fan of opium, I assure you. And he said it was the soul in a soulless world, and I think that might help contextualize what you were saying about the issue of the rise of religion, especially in the 70s and 80s in the United States, and the rise of the market economy. That is one of the, for better and for worse, one could say, one of the few places people in the United States could meet where there wasn't an exchange or investment and so forth, was their church, their temple, and their mosque. And it's just something to think about. But I want to be brief, and one of the reasons I believe the genius of the Republicans and the corporate elite have made us professors the villains is not because we give you too much work and we grade you and we try to make you work harder, but in all honesty, we really want you to think critically. And I think one of the reasons that the corporate elite and these corporations want to destroy public education is not only because of the profits that can be made, is because they don't want you to think critically. And I hope Thomas Frank's presentation got us all thinking critically about the words and the images we get bombarded with all the time. And in the last 10 years, it has accelerated almost exponentially, but also with an understanding as more and more women enter the labor market, the paid labor market. That is the way in which certain women, the most famous is the lean-in phenomenon. That is, if you just work hard, but be aware of all the problems you're going to have to face as a working mother, and I think it's the woman who's the head of Google who was able to create her own daycare center in her office. I know most of us who work can't really do that. But the lean-in phenomenon is becoming very attractive for corporate women. If any of you can stomach Morning Joe, Mika Brzezinski has this half an hour of corporate women who talk about how great they are just because they work so hard. I'm a real masochist. I get up and I watch it after I listen to WBAI, and then I whip myself. I go, why do I do this? The other thing that has also has reached critical discussion in some magazines like Jacobin, for example, is what's called the new black activism. Many of us were brought to tears with Kamen and Farrell all singing that wonderful song for Selma. But remember, these are two people who are one of the leading proponents now of charter schools and private investment, and the argument that that racism is no longer a collective struggle and it can be resolved individually. So I think we have to be ourselves aware of thinking critically about a lot of what we hear. And just to dovetail is, I think, what has begun to change the political discussion in the last 10 years has been activism of young people like yourself. My daughter, who is a journalist, spent about 2 weeks in Wisconsin during the big struggles against what Walker was trying to do, and that sparked a revolt. Karen Lewis, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union, I think has done more to get people to think critically about what's going on in terms of the attack on public education, has done as much as all of Diane Ravitch's great writings. Think of how Occupy, for whatever its strengths and whatever people claim were its weaknesses, got us thinking about inequality. The issue of hands up, whatever the government report said, has begun a struggle against inequality, racial and class inequality, and a growing struggle now across the country against privatization of education. So I think one of the reasons, to quote from Thomas Frank, why many of us now know this is a crock is because of the activism that's taken place. So I'm going to open this up to questions and comments from students or from faculty. And why don't you just identify yourself when you ask a question? Do you want to call on people? Is it easier for you to?
I think I should just shout.
Okay. Anarchy.
Lean in, shout.
No, don't lean in, shout. Stand up and shout. And if you don't start doing it soon, I get to pick on some of my students who I know are really smart and who know questions.
And don't ask me stock tips. Can I tell you a funny story? So I had trouble promoting this book. Not a lot of trouble, because like I say, the stock market crash helped me. But there was a big national magazine wanted to do a story about me in this book, and the author came out to Chicago and interviewed me at great length, and he kept asking me to pick stocks, and I refused. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And they wouldn't run the story. They finally told me they wouldn't run the story unless I picked stocks, unless I gave them a list of stocks that I thought people should invest in, because they wanted to peg it as an investment story. Isn't that hilarious? Yeah. So that story never ran. Come on, somebody's got questions. Come on. Yes.
I'm going to ask a question because I've done that far too much. I'm going to encourage the students in Comparative Industrialization who have just finished reading Engels' The Condition of the Working Class
Oh my
to
God.
ask a question or make a comment. Go. You can do it.
Yeah, speak up.
Right on. This is T.
Hi. I have a question in terms of the campaign of always talking about small businesses. You talked about how they were trying to change the image of the corporation by talking about how it had a soul. A lot of times when you hear reasons why businesses shouldn't be taxed or you shouldn't touch businesses because it'll hurt small businesses.
That's right.
How much truth is in that, or are they really just trying to counteract some image of big businesses and make it seem more mom and pop? Like, is that the...
That's very good. That's very good. I actually wrote about that later on, because this has mutated. It didn't just go away when the market crashed and all these guys went to prison and that sort of thing. It mutated and changed. And you saw that especially with the Tea Party movement, the thing about small business. So I wrote another book later on called Pity the Billionaire, where I asked that very question. What's up with what's the emphasis on small business all the time? And this is something that goes way back in American history, where big business will use small business as a kind of front to advance their agenda. It happens all the time, and it often happens. You don't even have big business, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Small businessmen will identify with big business and get out there and do this all on their own, and say, if you crack down on something or another, you're going to hurt all of these small businesses, and they're the real job creators in America, and we have to. There's this sort of climate of worship towards small business, and it's not. Just this kind of nonsense that I've been showing you, but the president himself and the last president and the president before that, they all go out there and talk about how wonderful small business is. Small business is something that you basically can't criticize in America as a category. It's like sacred, and that's exactly right. And so if Wall Street or somebody like that can couch their interests as the interests of small business, that's a really good way to sell it. And they do that all the time. Yeah?
You talked about the language of business in the late 90s, and how it was seen in ads and stuff. How is it looking today? How is it?
Well, you've got this. So all of this was badly discredited in the early aughts when the dot-com bubble crashed. You just go through all of those images that I gave you, and so many of the people depicted, it all turned out to be this terrible fraud. Even the Beardstown ladies, who are these very nice people, it turned out that they had added up their results incorrectly, and that they didn't have the kind of great return that they were telling everyone that they had. Even them, So it's not just Enron was gaming the California electricity market. I don't know if you guys remember this, but they had deliberately caused blackouts in California in the early aughts. It was crazy, and that really put an end to this kind of talk, that climate, that feverish climate that I was describing. But it came back in a different place, and that place was the real estate market. And you had very similar kind of language in the real estate market. And you also, well, to tell you the truth, I stopped following it. I lost interest in it. And didn't watch I don't watch CNBC anymore, and that sort of thing. But I don't know what, and so I don't have an answer, because I wonder what they're saying now. I mean, I should turn it on. I haven't paid attention for years, but after the bailouts, after the financial crisis and the bailouts, I don't know how these companies could do any of this stuff with a straight face without people just laughing at them. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
Market economy, and somehow it's from any social struggle, I feel like here at least capitalism, the word capitalism has vanished.
Yeah.
Talks
Oh,
about
I don't even use it myself. You didn't hear me say it, did you?
I know, and nobody talks about it. Somehow it's like it's nothing. It's something we have to find ourselves. We are our class, sex, gender, and finding our sexuality. It's like finding that authentic self, and it's somehow capitalism has vanished. And
Yeah.
it is we don't see that what exploitation, how that class, struggle.
That's exactly right. Can you guys hear what she's saying? Something very important. This is something that drives me up the wall. That you constantly hear about, and rightfully so, about issues of gender and issues of race, and you very rarely hear. I mean, issues of class are still very difficult for us to deal with, and we would rather just not talk about them, and so we don't. But class is a way of talking about capitalism. The reason I don't use the word capitalism, it's a different reason than what you just described. I mean, I am talking about capitalism, and I'll talk about big business, and I'll talk about markets, and I'll talk about Wall Street, and I'll talk about that. It's because the word itself is stigmatized. The word capitalism is a good way to make your audience just get up and walk out of the room. Especially when I'm out in the Midwest. Now, there are people, everywhere you go in this country, people are very receptive to criticism of Wall Street. Believe me, they hate those guys, They are very receptive to, when I say, look, corporate America is blaspheming, They're like, yeah, that's right, he's right about that. But if I start saying, down with capitalism, that's really not a good way to make the sale. You see what I'm saying? I shouldn't put it that way. I'm starting to talk like Tom Peters or something. That's not the brand called capitalism.
Yeah, from the part of the world I came from Indian subcontinent, there, I grew up reading about all those, I started reading like really young, Marx and Engels and everything else. So for me, it was kind of like a shock when I came here 5 years ago, and I'm like, I didn't see people talking about it, and here I could see the difference so much more than what I would see in Bangladesh, or so it's like.
Well, that's a relic of the Cold War, of course.
Yeah.
That's those Marx and Engels became for whatever reason fair or unfair, because they were the patron saints of the Soviet Union, our sworn enemy. We didn't read them anymore, or they became very deeply unpopular. Let's put it that way. But what's funny is that look, they always know to call me when I'm talking. But even while that was going on, we're talking about the Cold War. Some of the times when this country was probably when liberals were more liberal, progressives were more progressive, like much more so than they are now, and you had much greater social equality or economic equality, I should say. They had all sorts of other things were wrong in those days, and it took years to fix them. But what's happened in America is that we just have a different language for everything. You'll see.
Forbes, doesn't it still call itself Forbes, the capitalist tool?
Yeah. That's right. So
They're
they're able to
confident
use it. But
about
that's for the same reason the Wall Street Journal was able to hire me. By the way, I've always had a theory about that. So because my views are considered completely unacceptable for mainstream journalism. And then I got hired by the Wall Street Journal. Like, what the hell's up with that? How could that be? And what I think it is that because the right is not, they're inoculated against this critique. And so if someone like Forbes uses the word capitalism all the time in a positive way, they mean something like, that's us. We're capitalists and we're really good at it and we're proud of that. And in the same sense, the Wall Street Journal could never be accused of being part of the liberal media conspiracy. That accusation just wouldn't make any sense. And so they could hire whoever they wanted. Yeah. I'm sorry, I talk too much. You guys should just tell me to shut up.
You think about the growing inequality between the classes in today's society, like in the workplace, economic inequality, how it's like a large gap, and we saw it in the 90s. So is it getting bigger and bigger?
Yes, it's much worse now. In the 90s, what alarmed me in the 90s is that it was heading so sharply towards inequality, and today we really have achieved it. We've got there, we're back at the level of the 1920s. There's all kinds of literature on this now. I wrote a series of essays about it for Salon.com. There's I don't know, are you making them all read the Piketty book?
I don't know, because I'm not teaching this semester.
Oh.
I'm on a paid sabbatical, so I'm a lazy slug. And you have 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So Thomas Piketty, the French economist, wrote a pretty famous book earlier this year called Capital in the 21st Century. Sorry, last year. And it's about inequality, and he has the numbers more numbers than you could possibly want. And he's dug in some very interesting places. So he's able to compare modern inequality with like France in the 18th century and stuff like that. It's a really wonderful book, but it has a very dark, pessimistic conclusion that I don't entirely agree with. He thinks it's inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it, but I don't think that's the case. I think there's lots we can do about it. Yeah.
Last question, it has to be.
In terms of like the green revolution and like environmental sustainability, since the reports are getting higher and higher, do you think that's going to make its way sort of into like the trends that we're going to see in like financial stuff like in the stock market?
Do you mean global warming?
Yeah. It's quickly.
Look,
So, the thing about that story is that works only when people that are actually have money invest in that. Because I've done some, I won't say necessarily research, but I've done some typing in regard to that, and only when really strong investors invest in it is that when it actually starts gaining momentum.
That's when people start caring.
Yeah. But,
Gosh, isn't that funny? Because this is a democracy,
No,
right?
seriously, but
It's supposed to be.
But on a grassroots level, it's not picking up the way that it should, because truthfully, if it did, like, everyone living in Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico would all have solar energy.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
My
Because
Well,
question
it's-
was more
Yeah,
like.
Like, how's it going to make its way to this? I'm going to give you a really cynical answer. They're going to be running ads like claiming instead of talking about the corporate soul, they're going to be talking about how green they are. And they're already doing it. They call it greenwashing.
Because there are companies in New York that are saying that you can do that right now.
Yeah.
It's not affordable.
Yeah.
For most people.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Sorry, we do have to end this. Thank you all for coming.